It has all the hallmarks of a good disaster movie. An impending crisis that threatens to engulf the world. From an almost benign start, a hardly perceptible change in global temperature, the Earth could suddenly topple into crisis, reducing large tracts of land to desert and wreaking havoc on our culture. For proponents of the greenhouse effect, it heralds something akin to an apocalypse. An Earth parched and scorched by the sun, a climate in chaos. Nor is it a theory supported by a few cranks. It's been endorsed by the great and the good, by politicians and academics. There's only one problem. There's mounting evidence that it's not true. Certainly, when it comes to the weather, our impression of what's going on is often wrong. An Earth Day conference at the University of Missouri in the heart of the United States. One of the speakers at the conference is Pat Michaels, a professor of environmental science from the University of Virginia. He begins his lecture by asking the predominantly scientific audience how far the summer of 1988 differed from the normal in Missouri.
The group estimate is that Missouri averaged 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit above normal for the calendar year 1988.
In fact, it wasn't above average, it was below average.
You not only got the magnitude wrong, you got the sign wrong. And I've given this talk about 120 times in places that were colder than normal in 1988, which was much of the United States. Every crowd has estimated that it has been warmer than normal. I believe you are all very intelligent individuals. That's why you are here. So where did you get that perception? I would like to know.
The notion of a warming, the notion that a warming is catastrophic, is sort of drilled in to people to the point where it seems surprising that anyone would question it. And yet underlying it is very little evidence at all. In fact, there's ample evidence to the contrary.
And some experts are saying now that the whole world is heating up because of a global greenhouse effect. That is heat caught in the atmosphere by air pollution that prevents its escape. NBC's Robert Hager explains.
In Washington, a Senate committee heard some scientists say the phenomenon known as the greenhouse effect is here.
The problems unaddressed have the potential for turning the world into a form of chaos not greatly different from that produced by global war.
Information from satellites has convinced most scientists that average temperatures will rise by 2 to 5 degrees Celsius over the next 100 years.
But is there any real evidence of a forthcoming disaster?
No, I wouldn't think that there would. Wouldn't think there was any evidence for a catastrophic change in our climate at the present time.
No evidence at all?
There's no evidence at all.
The case for the greenhouse theory rests on 4 pillars. On the one hand, there's the factual evidence. Firstly, that the Earth's climate record shows temperature has increased and sea levels have risen. And secondly, that carbon dioxide, or CO2, has been the primary cause of these changes. Then there's the third pillar, which is not based on evidence from the past or the present, but on predictions of climate models that a doubling of CO2 will result in increases in global temperature of between 2 and 5 degrees. And finally, there's the underlying physics, which it is widely assumed proves that CO2 is a greenhouse gas and that further increases will result in increases in global temperature. So let's start with Pillar 1 and the facts about the Earth's climate record. It's far from easy to get an accurate picture of what's happening to the world's weather. Our evidence is dependent on thousands of individual measurements taken every hour of every day at weather stations throughout the world. It may be Basildon or Phoenix, Calcutta or Buenos Aires, but the techniques are the same. In addition to temperature measurements, each weather station collects data recording the amount of rain and the hours of sunshine. From these measurements, 60,000 every day, 22 million measurements a year, meteorologists try to discern what is happening to the Earth's climate. Analysis of temperature change over the last 100 years, carried out by the team at East Anglia University in England, has played an important role in support of the greenhouse case.
In the recent past, the last century or so, the global mean temperature has increased by about half a degree Celsius, that is. Doesn't sound like a very large amount, but it is a very significant and important change.
But such claims are not universally accepted. Richard Lindzen is Professor of Dynamic Meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston.
I think most scientists I know feel it would be very difficult to say anything about this record as it stands. I'm reasonably confident that given that record alone, few people would plausibly say that this indicates man has created warming.
There are a number of problems with the data. The first of which is that the weather stations are not evenly distributed around the globe.
Land is only about 30% of the Earth's surface. If you want to take a global average, you're already hoping that this 32% will be representative of the whole. So, for instance, you have St. Helena Island representing 1/3 the Atlantic Ocean. And that's a little bit questionable.
The weather stations may not be uniformly spread over the Earth, but in addition, they often tend to be situated in towns. In Phoenix, not only is the weather station in the middle of the city, it is also next to the airport runways, surrounded by acres of tarmac.
The surface right here, the rocks and all the asphalt at the airport, that just holds the heat in. We'll be 10 degrees warmer than anybody here overnight, because it's even noticeable when you drive away from here.
Phoenix is like every other city. As it has grown, the temperature has gone up. And because many of the world's weather stations are situated in towns, the temperature record is potentially threatened by this effect, the urban heat island phenomenon.
We've been able to detect heat islands in cities as small as 300 people. And the second we move into an urban environment, no matter how small, and begin to replace the natural vegetation with concrete, you would create something of a distortion in the temperature pattern. It's an effect that can add up to 2 or 3 degrees. And if we look at the issue of global warming, and we say how much warming do we think we should have seen or will see in the future, it's on the order of 1 or 2 or 3 degrees.
Dr. Balling has studied urban heat island effects in hundreds of cities throughout the United States.
We have to be careful when we look at people who say, I have detected global warming, because what they may have detected is urban warming.
Professor Wigley defends his data and plays down the urban heat island effect.
You can estimate what that residual effect might be, and we believe that it's quite small.
I agree, it is a small effect in terms of the total area of the globe that's being affected by urbanization. The problem is that most of our measurements come from these areas.
And an awful lot of the weather stations are in towns, aren't they?
A number of weather stations are in towns. There are a number of ways that one can account for that problem. The obvious way is just to eliminate those stations from the data set that you use to calculate the large area average temperature values.
But presumably there must be lots of towns where you don't have data from around them, so it's very difficult to tell whether there's been an urban effect or not.
That's right. And I should say that this is an area of ongoing research and still of some concern.
Dr. Balling's results would seem to justify that concern.